The year was 1885, and the loneliness of the high plains had a weight to it, a physical pressure that Nathaniel Blackwood felt in his bones. It was a silence pressed thin by the ceaseless wind, a quietude that had long ago settled over his ranch and his heart, filling the spaces left by a wife taken by fever and a childhood joy lost to time and tragedy. His world had shrunk to the sturdy frame of his son, Owen, and the demanding rhythm of the Lander cycle of mending fences, tending stock, and watching the sun bleed across the vast, indifferent sky. Nathaniel was a man carved from the same hard granite as the nearby foothills. His grief was not a loud, weeping thing, but a quiet, constant ache, a phantom limb that throbbed with the memory of his Lakota friend, Winona. They had been children together, their bond forged in the secret language of the prairie before the world had drawn its cruel lines between them. He had been sent east for schooling, and when he returned, she was gone, her people pushed further and further away by treaties written in ink and broken by greed. The not knowing was the worst part, a wound that never scabbed over. His life now was a fortress built against further loss. The walls were routine, the mortar was hard work, and the sole inhabitant he allowed inside was Owen. The boy at 7 years old was a spark of light in the grey expanse of Nathaniel's existence. He had his mother's bright eyes and a curiosity that the plains had not yet managed to tame. For him, Nathaniel endured. For him, Nathaniel rose each morning and faced the ghosts that whispered in the rustling cottonwoods. Their days were measured by chores. This morning, it was checking the north fence line, a task made urgent by a storm that had torn through the valley 2 nights prior. The sky, now scrubbed clean and impossibly blue, gave no hint of the violence it had unleashed. Owen rode his pony, Dusty, a short distance behind his father, his small form a study in concentration as he mimicked Nathaniel's posture in the saddle. They found her near a washout where the storm's runoff had carved a fresh scar in the earth. At first, Nathaniel thought she was a bundle of rags or a deer felled by the tempest. But then the bundle moved, a faint, shuddering motion that sent a jolt through him. He dismounted, his hand resting instinctively on the worn stock of the rifle in its scabbard, a reflex born of solitude and caution. "Stay there, Owen," he said, his voice low and steady, a command the boy knew not to question. He approached slowly. She was a woman, native, her dark hair matted with mud and what looked like dried blood. Her deerskin dress was torn, and one arm was bent at an angle that suggested a break. She was unconscious or close to it, her breathing shallow and ragged. Kneeling beside her, Nathaniel felt a cold dread mix with a reluctant surge of responsibility. The wilderness was unforgiving, but it had rules. You did not leave a person to die. Her face was bruised and swollen, but even through the grime, there was a delicacy to her features. He gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her forehead. Her skin was cold. He looked around, his eyes scanning the empty horizon. There were no tracks but her own, scuffed and desperate, leading from nowhere and ending here. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone. With a sigh that seemed to pull up something heavy from the bedrock of his soul, he knew what he had to do. He could not leave her. He wrapped her carefully in his slicker, his movements gentle despite the roughness of his hands. Lifting her was easier than he expected. She was light, fragile as a broken bird. As he settled her in front of him on his horse, Owen trotted closer, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Is she sleeping, Pa?" "Something like that," Nathaniel answered, his gaze fixed on the long path back to the ranch house. "She's hurt, son. We're going to help her." The woman's presence in his home was a profound disruption, a stone dropped into the still pool of his life. He laid her in the spare room, the one that had been his wife's sewing room and had remained untouched for 3 years, a shrine of silent grief. Laying a stranger in that bed felt like a betrayal, yet leaving her in the barn felt like a cruelty he could not stomach. He cleaned her wounds with a grim, functional efficiency. The gash on her temple was deep, the source of the bleeding. Her left forearm was indeed broken, a clean snap he set with practiced hands, skills learned from years of tending to injured livestock. As he worked, he remained detached, focusing on the mechanics of bone and sinew, refusing to see the person. But the house itself seemed to resist his detachment. The air, once thick with a comfortable silence, now crackled with the energy of a foreign presence. It felt smaller, more crowded. She remained unconscious for a full day and night. Owen hovered at the doorway, a small, anxious sentinel. "Will she wake up, Pa?" he asked for the 10th time. "We'll see," Nathaniel said, ladling broth into a bowl. "The best thing we can do is let her rest." When she finally did wake, it was not with a gentle flutter of eyelids, but with a gasp and a surge of pure terror. Her eyes, dark and wide, flew open and fixed on him. She scrambled backward on the bed, ignoring the sharp pain from her arm, until her back hit the wall. A low, guttural sound of fear escaped her throat. She was like a cornered animal, ready to fight for her life. "Easy," Nathaniel said, holding his hands up, palms open. He kept his voice soft, the same tone he used with a spooked horse. "You're safe here. You were hurt. I found you." She said nothing. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar log walls, the quilt, the figure of the tall white man standing before her. The fear in her gaze was a raw, primal thing. He saw no recognition, no understanding, only the desperate instinct of survival. "Do you know your name?" he asked gently. "Do you remember what happened?" She just stared, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He saw the flicker of a question in her eyes, a desperate search for an answer she did not possess. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. The fear was now joined by a profound, heart-wrenching confusion. He backed away slowly, leaving a tray of food and a cup of water on the small table by the bed. "I'll leave you be. Eat if you can." He closed the door quietly behind him. The image of her terrified eyes burned into his mind. The problem was no longer just a physical body to be mended. It was a shattered mind to be navigated, and he had no map. The days that followed fell into a tense, unspoken rhythm. He would leave food at her door, and later the plate would be empty. He caught glimpses of her moving about the small room, a shadow behind the curtain. The silence from her room was heavier than any he had known before. It was a silence born not of peace, but of fear and loss. He did not know what to call her, and in his thoughts she simply became the woman. Owen, however, was undeterred by the silence. One afternoon, Nathaniel found him sitting on the floor outside her closed door, humming a tuneless song to himself. "What are you doing, son?" "Singing to the lady," Owen replied simply, "so she won't feel so alone." The innocence of it struck Nathaniel, a sharp pang in his chest. He had forgotten what it was to offer comfort without expectation. The next day, he found the door to her room was ajar. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching Owen push a small wooden horse across the floorboards. She was still wary, her body coiled and ready to flee, but she had not shut the boy out. It was Owen who gave her a name. He had a favorite story about a river spirit his mother used to tell him, a gentle creature named Neva. One day, he pointed to the woman and declared, "Her name is Neva." The woman looked at the boy, and for the first time, something other than fear flickered in her eyes. She did not correct him. She did not speak. But from then on, when Nathaniel hesitantly used the name, she would respond with a slight inclination of her head. It was a name to hold on to in the blank emptiness of her mind, a gift from a child. Slowly, cautiously, Neva began to emerge from her cocoon. It started with small things. She would step out into the main room when Nathaniel was outside, her movements silent and graceful. He would return to find the dishes washed and stacked, or the floor swept clean. She did these things not as payment, but as if seeking a purpose, a way to anchor herself in a world that made no sense. He began to talk to her, not expecting replies, but simply to fill the silence. He told her about the ranch, about the seasons, about the stubbornness of his cattle. He spoke of Owen, his voice softening. He never spoke of his wife, and he never spoke of the ache that lived in the shape of a long-lost girl. One evening, as he was mending a harness by the fire, he glanced up to find her watching him. Her gaze was not fearful, but intensely curious. Her arm was healing, the splint a crude but effective brace. "The stitches on that are uneven," she said. Her voice was husky from disuse, the words soft but clear. Nathaniel stopped, stunned into stillness. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation. He looked down at the harness in his hands. "It'll hold," he said, his own voice sounding rougher than usual. She rose and came closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wood floor. She knelt beside him and pointed a slender finger at the leather. "If you pull the awl through at an angle, like this, the thread will lie flat. It will be stronger." He watched as she took a spare piece of leather and, with his awl, demonstrated. Her hands, though still marked by her ordeal, moved with an innate, confident skill. He saw in her movements a muscle memory that had survived whatever trauma had erased her name and her past. He handed her the harness. Without another word, she sat and began to unpick his clumsy work, her brow furrowed in concentration. They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of thread through leather. It was a new kind of silence, not empty, but shared. That night marked a subtle shift. A fragile truce gave way to a tentative companionship. She began to join him and Owen for meals, her presence at the table a quiet revolution. She rarely spoke, but she listened. She learned the rhythms of their life. She showed a surprising skill in the garden, a gentle touch that coaxed new life from the soil. She would sometimes hum a melody that felt ancient and sorrowful, a tune without words, a ghost of a memory. Nathaniel found himself watching her, searching her face for clues, for a hint of the person she had been. There was a strength in her, a resilience that humbled him. She had lost everything, even herself, yet she was not broken. She was bent, but she was finding a way to grow toward the sun. This growing closeness did not go unnoticed. The town of Redemption was a small, gossiping place, and on his infrequent trips for supplies, Nathaniel felt the weight of curious and judgmental eyes. A white rancher, a widower, living with a nameless native womanette, was fodder for the worst kind of speculation. Sheriff Miller, a man who saw the world in rigid lines of black and white, stopped him outside the general store. "Blackwood," he said, his tone heavy with implication. "Heard you have some company out at your place." "I have a guest," Nathaniel replied, his voice level, his jaw tight. "A guest who doesn't have a name? A squaw you found half dead?" The sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice near Nathaniel's boot. "Folks are nervous. There's been trouble with renegades up north. Could be she's part of it. Could be her people are looking for her, and they won't be friendly when they come." "She was hurt and alone. I did what any decent man would do," Nathaniel said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Decency can get a man killed," Miller warned. "You have a boy to think of. You'd be wise to send her on her way. Or I can take her off your hands, put her somewhere she can't cause trouble." The veiled threat was clear. The thought of Neva, with her quiet resilience and haunted eyes, locked in a cell, was intolerable. A protective instinct, fierce and unfamiliar, surged through him. "She's under my protection, Sheriff. She stays." He rode home with a cold fury simmering in his gut. The world and its prejudices were closing in. He had tried to keep it at bay, but it had followed him, threatening the fragile peace he was just beginning to find in the quiet company of the woman with no past. The threat materialized sooner than he expected, and not from the law. 2 men rode up to his ranch a week later. They were not from Redemption. They had the hard, merciless look of men who lived by the gun and took what they wanted. One was a hulking brute of a man with a scarred face, the other wiry and weasel-like. Nathaniel met them on the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. Owen and Neva were inside. "We're looking for someone," the scarred man, who called himself Vance, said without preamble. His eyes roved over the cabin, cold and assessing. "A Cheyenne woman. Ran off from us during the storm. Heard you might have found her." "I don't know who you're talking about," Nathaniel lied, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Vance chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Don't play dumb, rancher. We tracked her this far. She saw something she shouldn't have. We just want to tie up a loose end. Give her to us, and we'll be on our way. No trouble for you or the boy." Through the window, Nathaniel saw a flicker of movement. Neva was pulling Owen away from the door, her face a mask of dawning horror. A flash of memory, violent and terrifying, seemed to cross her features. Her hand went to her temple, and she swayed. These were the men who had hurt her. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a certainty that rose from a place deeper than reason. "You're not welcome here," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Get off my land." The weasel-like man started to draw his pistol, but Vance held up a hand. "All right, rancher, have it your way." He gave Nathaniel a smile devoid of all warmth. "But we'll be back, and when we come back, we won't be so polite." They turned their horses and rode off, leaving a palpable tension in the air. Nathaniel knew it was not an idle threat. They would be back, likely under the cover of darkness. He went inside, his mind racing. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Neva was huddled in a corner with Owen, her arms wrapped around him. She was trembling, not with fear for herself, but with a terror that radiated from a newly remembered place. They killed a man," she whispered, her eyes wide with the horror of the memory breaking through. "A prospector. They took his gold." So that was it. She was a witness, a loose end. Nathaniel looked at her, at the raw memory surfacing in her eyes, and then at his son. The fortress he had built was about to be besieged. "We'll be ready for them," he said, the words feeling inadequate against the coming storm. Night fell like a shroud. Nathaniel barred the door and shuttered the windows. He had Owen lie on a pallet behind the heavy stone fireplace. Neva refused to hide. She stood by the hearth, her face pale but resolute. In her hand she clutched a heavy iron poker, her knuckles white. They were in this together. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind was the sound of approaching death. They came just before dawn, the darkest hour. The splintering crash of a window shutter being torn from its hinges shattered the silence. "Stay with the boy," Nathaniel yelled, grabbing his rifle. A shot exploded, and the lantern on the table shattered, plunging the room into a chaos of moonlight and shadow. He fired back toward the window, the roar of the rifle deafening in the enclosed space. He saw a shape fall back outside, one down. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow. The bar was straining. He knew it wouldn't hold for long. Vance's voice bellowed from outside. "Last chance, Blackwood. Send out the squaw." Nathaniel moved to brace the door, but the weasel-like man was already clambering through the broken window. He raised his pistol, aiming at Nathaniel's back. Before Nathaniel could turn, a dark shape flew through the air. Neva had moved with impossible speed, swinging the heavy poker with all her might. The iron connected with the man's head with a sickening crunch. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. The door burst inward, the bar splintering, and Vance stood framed in the doorway, a massive, terrifying silhouette against the pre-dawn gloom. He fired, and Nathaniel felt a searing pain rip through his left shoulder. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the floor. His arm went numb. Vance advanced into the room, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Should have listened, rancher." He raised his gun, the muzzle a dark O aimed at Nathaniel's chest. But he had forgotten Neva. She launched herself at him, not with the poker this time, but with her body, a desperate, snarling fury. She was no match for his size, but her attack was so unexpected it gave Nathaniel a precious second. He lunged for his fallen rifle with his good arm, but Vance threw her off him with a brutal shove. She fell hard against the corner of the table, her sleeve tearing from shoulder to elbow. As she lay there, dazed, the moonlight from the open door fell across her exposed arm, and Nathaniel saw it. Just below her shoulder, stark against her skin, was a small, perfectly formed birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon. Time stopped. The roaring in his ears faded. The pain in his shoulder disappeared. He was no longer in his cabin in 1885. He was a boy of 10, sitting by a creek with a girl whose laughter was the sound of wind chimes. He was tracing that exact same mark on her arm with a piece of grass, telling her it was where the moon had kissed her before she was born. Winona, he breathed, the name torn from a place of grief so deep he thought it had been sealed forever. The sound of her true name, a name she had not heard in an eternity, seemed to cut through Vance's murderous focus. He glanced from Nathaniel to the woman on the floor, his brow furrowing in confusion. That moment of hesitation was all Nathaniel needed. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and 20 years of repressed love and loss, he scrambled for the rifle, swung it up, and fired from his hip. The shot echoed the finality of a closing door. Vance crumpled to the ground, the conflict over. Silence descended, broken only by Owen's frightened whimpers from behind the fireplace and Nathaniel's own ragged breathing. The pain in his shoulder returned with a vengeance, but it was a distant thing, a faint signal from a world that had just been irrevocably altered. He stumbled over to the woman on the floor. He knelt, his good hand shaking as he reached out, not to the wound on her head, but to the mark on her arm. He touched it, his fingers tracing the familiar shape. It was real. "Winona," he said again, his voice cracking with the impossible truth of it. Her eyes, which had been dazed with pain, slowly focused on his face. She looked at his hand on her arm, at the birthmark, and then back to his eyes. The name echoed in the vast, empty chambers of her mind. Winona. It was not a memory, not yet, but a sound that fit, a key turning in a lock, rusted shut for years. A single, crystalline tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "Nathaniel," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips, a fragment of a life she couldn't remember, but her heart had never forgotten. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet wonder. Nathaniel's shoulder healed, a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of the night his world tilted on its axis. But the true healing was happening in the spaces between them. Winona's memory did not return in a sudden flood, but in small, unpredictable streams. The scent of pine needles would evoke a flash of 2 children hiding in a forest. The taste of wild berries would bring a phantom echo of laughter. He never pushed her. He simply started telling her stories. He told her about a boy and a Lakota girl who believed the creek that ran between their lands was a magical kingdom. He told her about the promises they made, to always be friends, to find each other no matter what. He spoke of his grief, not just for his wife, but for the girl he had lost so long ago, the girl who had, impossibly, come home. She would listen, her dark eyes fixed on his face, absorbing the pieces of her own lost life. She was still Neva, the quiet, resilient woman who had survived, but now she was also becoming Winona again. The girl with the moon-kiss mark and a shared history with the solemn man and his bright-eyed son. Owen, with the simple wisdom of a child, accepted it all. "So Neva is your friend, Pa?" he asked one day. "Yes, son," Nathaniel said, his gaze finding Winona's across the room. "She's my oldest friend." One evening, they stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. Owen was asleep inside. The house was quiet. The harsh, lonely land no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a sanctuary, a witness. "I remember the color," Winona said softly, her voice gaining strength each day. "You told me the sky was blushing because the sun was kissing it goodnight." Nathaniel turned to her, his heart swelling. It was the first complete memory she had offered, a perfect, polished stone pulled from the river of her past. He saw in her eyes not a stranger, not a victim, but the person who had known him before the world had laid its burdens upon him. "I remember," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. "I remember everything." The silence that fell between them was no longer empty or tense. It was full. It was the comfortable quiet of two souls who had found their way back to each other across an impossible distance. The wind still whispered through the cottonwoods, but it no longer sounded of ghosts and grief. It sang a song of resilience, of unexpected kindness, and of a love that had refused to be forgotten. On the high plains, under a sky bruised with the first stars, Nathaniel Blackwood was no longer alone. He was home.